There is something quietly strange about the way you pay for things. Not the act of paying itself, but the feeling that comes after. Or more precisely, the feeling that doesn't come. You tap your card, a small chime, a green light, and then you walk away, coffee in hand, bag on your shoulder, carrying something you now own, but feeling as though nothing has left you at all. That sensation, that smooth, consequence-free transaction, is not an accident. You have probably heard that credit cards encourage spending. That is the surface-level truth, the polite version of the story. But there is something underneath that explanation that most people never get close enough to examine, something that has less to do with how much you spend and more to do with the way your brain has been trained to experience the act of spending itself. The discomfort of spending money is called the pain of paying. It is a real psychological phenomenon, studied and measured and documented. And your credit card, the one in your wallet right now, was engineered over decades to reduce that pain as close to zero as possible. Not because the bank cares about your comfort, but because a mind that feels no discomfort spends more freely. That is where we begin. Think about the last time you paid for something with cash, not a vague memory, a specific moment. The feeling of taking the note from your wallet, folding it into the hand of someone behind a counter, and receiving change you then had to put somewhere. There was a weight to it, even if it was only $5, only $10, something registered. Now think about the last time you topped your card. Can you even name what you bought? Can you feel it? Most people cannot, and most people have stopped noticing that they cannot. You wake up in the morning and you make a coffee from a subscription you set up 8 months ago. The payment processes silently in the background. No notification, no confirmation, no moment of awareness. It simply happens, the way breathing happens, the way rent appears as a line on a statement you check once a month if you remember to at all. You take the train, the fare is deducted from a linked account. You do not look. There is nothing to look at. The barrier opens and you walk through and you are already thinking about the meeting you are going to, the message you forgot to send, the dream you half remembered from last night. Lunch is ordered from an app. You do not see a number. You see a photograph of a bowl of noodles. You press a button. 40 minutes later, someone hands you a bag through a door you barely had to open. The cost appears somewhere, eventually, in a list that is organized neatly and color-coded if you have a bank that does that, which many of them do now, because even the review of your spending has been designed to feel pleasant rather than alarming. This is your financial life. Not unusual, not irresponsible, ordinary. And inside this ordinariness, something has been happening to you so gradually, so thoroughly, that it does not feel like something happening at all. It just feels like the way things are. Here is what the bank understands about you that you may not have understood about yourself. Spending money, real money, physical money, produces a mild but measurable stress response. Researchers have watched it in brain scans. The insula, a part of the brain associated with negative emotion, activates when people part with cash. It's a small flicker of discomfort, a hesitation, a private internal check. Is this worth it? That check is not a flaw. That check is how wealth is preserved. The credit card was not invented to give you convenience. Convenience was the marketing. The deeper engineering was about removing friction. And the friction that was being removed was the exact psychological friction that made you pause before spending. When you swipe, when you tap, there is a temporal gap between the action and the consequence. You spend now and you pay later. The payment happens somewhere else, in some future moment, attached to a number on a screen that already has many other numbers on it, and so the emotional weight of any individual purchase is diluted across everything else, averaged out, absorbed into a monthly total that feels less like a series of choices you made and more like a vague, inevitable outcome.
This is not an accident. This is architecture. The banks call it friction reduction. What it does to your psychology is a kind of emotional amnesia. You forget that you spent. More accurately, you never fully registered that you spent in the first place. The spending happened, but the experience of loss, the signal that would normally recalibrate your behavior, was intercepted before it could form. And a person who does not fully experience loss is a person who will not adjust their behavior to avoid it. That person spends more, every time, predictably, measurably. The bank knows this. The bank has always known this. The credit system is not a complicated thing at its core. It is simply this: someone else pays for what you want today, and you agree to pay them back tomorrow, plus a little more for the arrangement. That little more is the business. But the credit system is also a behavioral system, and the behavioral system is considerably more elegant than the financial one. Consider how credit limits are communicated to you, not as a ceiling, as a kind of permission. You have been approved for $10,000. The language of approval carries a subtle moral weight, as though the institution has reviewed you and found you worthy, as though the limit is a reflection of your value, not simply a calculation of how much debt you are likely to carry without defaulting. The limit is not a gift, it is a target. The industry knows that people tend to spend toward their limit over time, not all at once, gradually, through the ordinary accumulation of small decisions, each one reasonable in isolation, until the balance carries a weight that begins to feel permanent rather than temporary. And here is the quieter mechanism inside all of this: the minimum payment. The minimum payment is perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated financial product ever designed. It does not feel like a trap. It feels like a mercy. When a bill arrives for $1,400 and the minimum payment listed is $42, something in the mind relaxes. The problem feels manageable. The $42 feels like progress. You pay it. You feel responsible. You have, in the language of the statement, remained in good standing. What the minimum payment actually does is ensure that the remaining $1,358 begins generating interest immediately, at a rate that, compounded over time, will cost you more than the original purchase. The debt does not shrink. It breathes. It grows slowly enough that you do not notice, quickly enough that it never quite disappears. The system is not designed to free you from debt. It is designed to keep you comfortable inside it. Comfortable is the key word. Discomfort leads to change. Comfort leads to continuation. And continuation is what the institution requires. None of this is malicious in any simple sense. The system is not thinking about you. It is not trying to harm you any more than a river is trying to carve a canyon. It moves along the path of least resistance, and the path of least resistance runs straight through the gap between your spending and your awareness of it. There is a moment, and you may have experienced a version of it without naming it, where you look at a bank statement and feel, for just a second, that you are looking at someone else's life. The numbers are yours, the purchases are yours, the dates and locations are accurate, but the total does not match the internal record you were keeping, or rather, the internal record you thought you were keeping, but were not really keeping at all. That gap between the spending you experienced and the spending that actually occurred is where the system lives. When you see an advertisement for a credit card now, you will notice something you may not have noticed before. The advertisement does not talk about debt. It does not talk about interest. It talks about rewards. It talks about points. It talks about the feeling of being someone who has access, who belongs to a level of service, who travels in a particular way and eats in particular places and exists inside a curated version of financial life that the card itself makes possible. The reward is real, technically. The cash back exists.
The miles accumulate, but the reward is approximately 1 to 2% of what you spend, returned to you in a form that encourages further spending, while the behavior the rewards incentivize generates, on average, 17 to 20% interest on any carried balance. The math has never been in your favor. The design has always been in theirs. But here is what changes when you understand this, and it is not what you might expect. The change is not anger. It is not a sudden urge to close your accounts and live on cash and withdraw from the financial system entirely. Those impulses tend to pass, and the system will still be there when they do. What changes is something quieter, a small recalibration in the way you observe your own behavior. A slight hesitation before the tap, before the click, before the automatic renewal. Not because you have learned a rule, but because you have begun to notice the mechanism. And a mechanism that is seen is a mechanism that loses some of its power. You start to feel the money leaving, not dramatically, not with distress, just accurately, the way you were always supposed to feel it before someone decided that feeling was inconvenient for their revenue model. You begin to see the design in the things you once accepted as neutral, the rounded corners on the card, the top-to-pay animation, the congratulatory language when a transaction is approved, the app that shows your spending in soft colors with gentle labels, the notification that arrives the next morning, not at the moment of purchase, but a safe distance away, when the decision has already been made and cannot be reversed. All of it designed, all of it working exactly as intended. And now you are watching it work, from a slightly different position, from the outside rather than from inside. There is no clean conclusion to this. The system does not end because you understand it. The card does not stop working. The interest does not forgive itself. The minimum payment will still appear at the bottom of your statement, reasonable looking and patient, month after month, for as long as there is a balance to maintain. What shifts is only this: your relationship to your own attention. Money, at its most fundamental, is a form of stored decision-making. Every dollar represents a moment in the past where you traded time or labor or thought for a token that could later be exchanged for something else. The system's interest is in making sure that exchange happens often and smoothly and with as little deliberation as possible. Your interest, if you choose to locate it, is nearly the opposite. Not in hoarding, not in fear, not in the obsessive accounting of every small transaction, but in something closer to presence, in returning to yourself the awareness that was quietly lifted away from you, not through force, but through design so seamless you mistook it for convenience. The pain of paying when it returns, and it can return simply by paying in ways that make the transaction feel real, is not something to be avoided. It is information. It is your own judgment reasserting itself into a process that had been engineered to exclude it. A person who feels their spending spends differently. Not perfectly, not always wisely, but differently. With a sense, however faint, that the decision was actually made, that it belonged to them, that it was not simply processed somewhere in the background while their attention was elsewhere. The bank designed the card shaped the habit became invisible. You have looked at the invisible thing now. That is the only place anything changes. Not with urgency, not with a plan, just with eyes that are open in a way they were not quite open before. Thank you for watching this, not as a phrase, but genuinely. You gave this 30 minutes, which is itself a kind of currency. I hope it returned something useful, not a solution, not a system to follow, but perhaps a slightly different angle on something you have always been close to but never quite seen from the outside. If this kind of thinking is what you come here for, the quiet examination of the systems that shape ordinary life, the ones that work best when we do not notice them at all, then subscribing would mean these conversations find you when they happen. No urgency in that, just an open door. And if something in here landed for you, if there was a moment where something shifted or a question it raised that you were still sitting with, I would genuinely like to know what it was. Not for the algorithm, for the conversation. Leave it below if you're willing. The comment section is quieter than most. People tend to think before they type. That seems right for this kind of place.